How's it going? Today we're going to be building a personal expense tracker. It's very easy to do, however, it involves knowledge of some key Excel functions such as pivot tables, if functions, and data validation. If you're interested in the personal expense tracker but don't want to build it, it's also available at the link in my description, complete with instructions, the input, dashboard, and then some pivot tables. Now, without further ado, let's get into the tutorial. So to start off, let's just go and open a new workbook and name it My Personal Expense Tracker. Let's hit enter. Okay, and now we have our personal expense tracker workbook ready to do whatever we would like with it. I like to get rid of the grid lines, so if we go to view and hit grid lines, those will all disappear and it just makes it more visually appealing. Let's double click this tab name and call it input and dashboard. Okay, now first thing we're going to want to do is create the headings. We're going to have our date, our description, our category of expense or revenue, and then we're going to have whether it's a revenue, an expense, and what the final balance is. Okay, we're also going to want to categorize the revenues and expenses, maybe 3 different revenues, and let's say up to 5 different expenses. Okay, I'm just going to go and put a border around that, hit Control B to bold it, and then put more borders there. Okay, so in these sections, we'll input the various types of revenues and expenses, such as salary, investment, income, etc. And then expenses might be rent, groceries, or gas. Okay, let's go ahead and bold these as well. Okay, so we have our headings, we have our categories. Okay, and now all we need is a little drop down here to input our expenses and revenues. And for the sake of this video, we're not going to make it too big. So we're just going to go about that far. And we got to do the correct formatting for each of these columns. So for this one, let's go to General and do short date. Description and category, those can be general, but revenue, expense, and balance, we're going to want to make that the currency format. Okay? Now that we have this in place, we're going to want to do the following formula to get us started. For the first one, we do equals our revenue minus expenses. This is because there's no beginning balance, so there's nothing to add the revenues and subtract the balances from. And for the next one, since there is a beginning balance, we're going to do the formula equals the prior balance plus our revenues minus our expenses. And we're going to go ahead and drag that all the way down. And to prevent this last little row from losing its border, we're going to select fill without formatting. And you see that came back right there. However, we don't want all these zeros. It just looks a little bad. So let's go ahead and do the formula equals if, and we'll say our revenues minus our expenses are equal to 0. Then we'll say nothing. We'll do these parentheses as you see here, or quotation marks, comma. The false value is this formula, and let's put parentheses at the end of it. You can see those go away. Double click it down, fill without formatting only. And so basically what this is saying is that if our revenues minus expenses equals 0, then this column will be blank. And since we'll never have a revenue and expense in the same row, this will always mean that there's no entry there. Okay, so we have our format figured out. Let's go ahead and do some of the more nitty-gritty things. So let's start by opening a new tab and calling it Pivot Tables. And before we get into any pivot tables, let's go ahead and clear the grid lines and do the following thing. Let's enter categories. Okay? And this will make sense in a second. We're going to have all of our categories right here. And since if we were to go to data validation, select a list, and try to do the source of this, comma, this, it wouldn't work. So what I like to do is do equals our revenues. Drag, we have 3 different possible revenues. And then this next one, equal expenses. And we have 5 different types of expenses. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? So let's go ahead, put some borders around that just so it looks a little cleaner. Resize it. And then let's finish up our revenues and expenses. Let's call one side hustle. And then for our expenses, maybe we have child care, and maybe we have some hobbies we like to do. And you can see if we go here, then those are all filled in. So now what I want to do for our categories is go to data, data validation, and select list. Okay, and the source of this list is going to be what we just had here. Let's go ahead and highlight all of it and select OK. And you can see now we have all of these data drop downs to choose from. Let's go ahead and drag this down. And as you can see, all of these lines filled in. So what we're going to want to do is fill without formatting so those go away. So now, no matter where we go, if we want to check that, it'll pop up. Now, before we can get into any of the pivot tables, we're going to need some data. So I'm going to pause this video and skip through so that all this is filled out and we can get some pivot tables going. All right, so now we have some sample data here comprising of some days in 2024 and the remainder starting off in 2025, all in date format. We've had our descriptions, our categories, our revenues, expenses, and balances, all in currency format, amounting to an ending balance of $5,075. Now to get started on the pivot table, let's select anywhere in this table and select Control A to highlight everything. Let's go to Insert, Pivot Table, and select From Table/Range, which is this table. Let's say we want the pivot table to be in this current worksheet somewhere around here. So let's put K4 and select OK. All right, so we're going to want to be looking at expenses for this particular pivot table. So let's go ahead and in our values put expenses, the sum of our expenses to be exact. Let's look at categories in our rows so we can see which categories in particular are leading to these expenses. And finally, we want dates to be in filters, but in order to break it up before that, we need to put it into rows, as we're going to want it to be broken up into months and years. So given the options for quarters, we're going to go ahead and remove that. And let's go ahead and put our years and months up here. We can also get rid of the date down here. And now you can see we have these filters up here. We can toggle between various months and various years. Okay, so now what we can do is we can go to pivot chart and we can select a pie chart that we would like. There's 3D, 2D, pie of a pie. For this particular instance, let's just go with the typical 2D pie chart. Select OK, and we have all of this here. I'm going to go ahead and move this pivot table to this other sheet. So I'm going to select all of this, hit Control X, and then Control V over here. And we have it on this tab with the rest of the pivot tables are going to be. Okay, so now we have this pie chart. And you see here we have these silver headings, which is something we might not necessarily want. So let's go to Pivot Chart Analyze, click Field Buttons, and select Hide All. That'll get rid of all those buttons that we don't want to be seeing. Let's go ahead, resize this. If we hold Alt, then it'll snap to the size of these boxes for the cells. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. Let's fix it up here. Perfect. Let's then go ahead and rename this chart Expenses by Type. Okay, now let's go to the Pivot Table tab. Select all of this, hit Control Copy, and Control Paste. We're going to want to be doing the same thing now, but instead of expenses, we're going to be looking at our revenues. So same thing, let's just put revenues down there. Another thing we can do is select all of these, and if we want to go to Home, select a different currency, select the currency number format, and we'll have it this way as well, which is something I sometimes like to do. Okay, so same thing here. Let's go to Pivot Table, Analyze, Pivot Chart, and let's do the same pie chart as before. Okay, let's hit Control X, and then Control V over here, and we can move it onto this tab. We again want to get rid of these buttons, so let's select Hide All, resize it using the Alt button, and rename it Revenues by Type. Now that we've made these first two pie charts, it's time to move on to the final graphic, which displays our net income. So if we go here, select Control Copy and Control Paste again over here, we can do a similar thing for net income. Let's pull up our field list, shift this into view, and what we can actually do is create a calculated field. So if we go to Fields, Sets, and Items and select Calculated Field, we're actually able to pull up a net income filter, which we can put in our values as opposed to revenues or expenses. So let's go ahead and in the name, put net income. And in the formula, let's do equals, double click our revenues, minus, double click our expenses, and select OK. What we instead can do is remove these categories, select revenues and expenses in here, and we can see the sum of our net income, the sum of our revenue, and the sum of our expenses. And these are all filtered out, whether we want it for 2024, 2025, or multiple different months of the year. So let's go ahead, Pivot Table Analyze, Pivot Chart, and let's select this chart here to show us the differences between our revenues, expenses, and our net income. So let's go ahead and do Control X again, and then hit Control V on this tab. We want to get rid of these field buttons, so let's do Hide All, and maybe we want to resize this just a little bit. Okay? And now you can do whatever you want with the graphs here. Maybe you want to bold these, change their colors, maybe you want to delete these lines. But for the sake of this video, we're just going to leave everything as it is. And you can name this sum of revenues, expenses, and net income for the year or for the month or whatever you'd like. But now we're going to get into something called slicers. Now, if you're not familiar with slicers, they're basically just filters that you can click that act as buttons and affect the graphs that are shown from your pivot tables. So if we go to our pivot tables and select the first one, go to Pivot Table Analyze and select Insert Slicer, we can insert slicer. For first, let's choose months. Okay, and this is what our slicer looks like. Shows all of the months we have, and you're able to select different ones, and you can see that those graphs change as you select different ones. So let's go ahead and click Control X, and then Control V over here, and we can see our slicer in action. Let's go ahead and do the same thing, but for our years slicer. Control X, and then Control V. Okay, so we can change data for 2024 and 2025, as well as multiple different months. And in order to clear these filters, just click this X button in the top right corner. And you may notice that when we change these filters, it only affects the first pivot table, which is what we made the slicers based off of. In order to get around this, if you click your slicer and go to the slicer dropdown up here, report connections, and select all the pivot tables you would want to be affected by this, just go ahead and check those boxes. Now when we do this, we can see all of our pivot tables change. 2024, 2025, just March. Let's clear these connections, clear these filters, so you can see just how effective slicers are in showing pivot tables and different graphs. Now, a key thing to note with pivot tables is that they don't automatically refresh. So let's go ahead and do one final entry. Let's say 6-1-2025. Let's say it was our rental payment and it costed $1,500. Okay, so we can see it updates here, but we can see there's no change here. So what we're going to want to do is go to this first pivot table, right click and select refresh. And when we do that, we can see that this data does finally change. So it's so important to select refresh when you do. Thank you guys again for watching. If you are interested in getting a personal expense tracker of your own, go ahead and click the link in the description. It comes with instructions, the input and dashboard tab in perfect format, and then also your table so you can update and track your pivot tables as they move. Thank you guys again, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you next time.